The rifle barrel gleamed cold against the morning frost as Joan Taylor pressed herself deeper into the shadow of the pine tree, her breath coming in sharp white puffs that might give away her position. Below in the valley, the mountain man's cabin sat silent, smoke curling lazily from its stone chimney. His horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion, stood tethered near the corral, pawing at the snow-covered ground. She had been watching for 3 days now, learning his patterns, waiting for this moment when he would venture into the forest to check his trap lines. Her stomach cramped with hunger so fierce it made her vision blur, and she pressed one trembling hand against her hollow belly. The horse represented salvation, the difference between death and survival for her and her young son waiting back in their makeshift shelter. The sound of boots crunching through snow made her freeze. Raymond Nelson emerged from the cabin, his tall frame moving with the easy confidence of a man who belonged to this harsh wilderness. He wore a heavy coat of dark wool, and his weathered face showed no sign of the bitter cold that cut through Joan's threadbare cloak like a knife. She watched him shoulder his pack and rifle, then stride toward the forest path that led north to his trap lines. This was her chance, perhaps her only chance. She had studied his routine carefully, knew he would be gone for hours checking the snares and deadfalls scattered across his territory. But as she prepared to move, something made him pause and turn back toward the cabin, his sharp eyes scanning the tree line where she hid. Joan held her breath, pressing herself so tightly against the rough bark that she could feel it catching at her worn dress. Had he seen her? After what felt like an eternity, Raymond shook his head and continued into the forest, his footsteps gradually fading until only the whisper of wind through pine needles remained. She waited another 10 minutes, counting each second, before finally creeping down the slope toward the corral. The horse lifted its head as she approached, nostrils flaring at her unfamiliar scent, but it did not shy away. Perhaps it sensed her desperation, or perhaps it was simply well-trained and gentle by nature. Joan's hands shook as she untied the lead rope, her fingers so numb from cold that she could barely work the knots. The stallion was even more beautiful up close, its coat gleaming like burnished copper in the pale sunlight. She had grown up around horses on her father's farm before marriage had taken her away from that life, before her husband's death had left her alone and destitute in this unforgiving country. The animal stood patiently as she struggled with the rope, and when she finally freed it, she felt a moment of triumph so fierce it almost brought tears to her eyes. She had done it. She had stolen the horse that would carry her and her son to safety, to the settlement 3 days' ride south where her sister lived. But as Joan prepared to lead the horse away, a voice spoke from behind her, low and calm and utterly without surprise. Planning to take him far? She spun around to find Raymond Nelson standing at the edge of the clearing, his rifle held casually in one hand, pointing at the ground. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized he had never left at all, had somehow circled back, or perhaps never gone more than a few yards into the forest. The trap had been for her, and she had walked into it like the desperate fool she was. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "My son is dying." The words hung in the air between them, stark and terrible in their honesty. Raymond's expression did not change, but something flickered in his dark eyes, a shadow of understanding or perhaps recognition. He took a step closer, and Joan instinctively moved to put the horse between them, though she knew it would provide little protection if he chose to use that rifle. "Where is he?" Raymond asked, and the question surprised her. She had expected anger, threats, perhaps violence. Instead, his voice held only quiet curiosity, as if he were asking about the weather or the condition of the trails. "Half a mile east," Joan said, pointing toward the ridge where she had built their shelter in a cave overhang. "He has fever. He needs medicine, food. We have nothing." She hated the way her voice broke on the last word, hated showing this stranger her weakness, but there was no point in pretending strength she did not possess. Raymond studied her for a long moment, taking in her hollow cheeks, the way her dress hung loose on her thin frame, the desperation that radiated from her like heat from a fever. "How long since you have eaten?" he asked. The question caught her off guard. 2 days, she admitted, then immediately wished she had lied. Why give him more ammunition to use against her? but something in his manner suggested he already knew the answer, had perhaps been watching her as carefully as she had been watching him. And the boy? 3 days. The admission tore from her throat like a confession. I gave him the last of our food 3 days ago. Raymond nodded slowly as if this confirmed something he had suspected. He leaned his rifle against a fence post and began walking toward her, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Joan tensed, ready to run, but where could she go? On foot in this wilderness, she would be dead within hours. The horse was her only hope, and he stood between her and escape. "What's your name?" Raymond asked when he was close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair. "Joan," she said, then added reluctantly, "Joan Taylor." "Joan Taylor," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "And your son?" "Timothy." The name came out as barely more than a breath. "He's only 7. Something shifted in Raymond's expression at that, a softening so subtle she might have imagined it. He reached out slowly, telegraphing his movements, and took the horse's lead rope from her nerveless fingers. For a moment she thought he would send her away empty-handed, condemn her and Timothy to death in the name of property and law. Instead, he handed the rope back to her. "Take him," Raymond said simply. Joan stared at him, certain she had misheard. "What?" "Take the horse. Ride to wherever you need to go." He stepped back, giving her clear access to mount. "But first, let me see your son." The offer was so unexpected, so contrary to everything that she had prepared herself for, that Joan could only stand frozen in confusion. "I don't understand," she whispered. "You're not the first desperate woman to come through these mountains," Raymond said, his voice gentle now. "And that boy of yours shouldn't suffer for his mother's pride." Pride. The word hit her like a slap. "This isn't about pride," Joan said, anger flaring in her chest. "This is about survival." "I know," Raymond replied calmly. "That's why I'm offering to help." Joan searched his face for signs of deception, for the cruel trap she was certain must be hidden beneath his apparent kindness. Men did not simply give away valuable horses to thieves, no matter how desperate those thieves might be. There had to be a catch, a price she would be expected to pay. "What do you want in return?" she asked. "Nothing you're not willing to give," Raymond said, and there was something in his tone that made her believe him, against all reason and experience. She thought of Timothy, lying fevered and weak in their makeshift shelter, his small body burning with sickness, while she struggled to find food and medicine. She thought of the long journey ahead, the dangers that waited on the mountain trails, the slim hope that her sister would take them in when they finally reached the settlement. All of it seemed impossible without a horse, and here was this stranger offering exactly what she needed most. "Why?" Joan asked. Why would you help me?" Raymond was quiet for so long that she began to think he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and careful. "I had a son once, and a wife. They died of fever one winter when I couldn't get them to a doctor in time." He paused, his gaze distant. "I know what it's like to watch someone you love slip away while you stand helpless." The simple honesty of his confession broke something open in Joan's chest. She had been so focused on survival, on the immediate crisis of food and shelter, that she had forgotten other people carried their own burdens of loss and regret. "I'm sorry," she said and added. "Don't be sorry," Raymond replied. "Just let me help." Joan looked at the horse, then back at Raymond's weathered face. Every instinct screamed at her to be suspicious, to look for the trap, but Timothy's fevered face rose in her mind and made the decision for her. "All right," she said, "but I still don't understand why you're doing this." "Maybe you will. In time," Raymond said. He moved to the horse's side and checked the saddle, adjusting the stirrups with practiced efficiency. "Can you ride?" "Yes," Joan said. "I grew up on a farm." "Good. The trail to town is treacherous this time of year, but Copper knows the way." He patted the horse's neck affectionately. "He'll get you there safely." Joan mounted carefully, her weak legs trembling with the effort. The saddle felt strange after so many months of walking, but the horse stood perfectly still beneath her, as if sensing her fragility. "Thank you," she said, looking down at Raymond. "I don't know how to repay you." "Show me your son first," Raymond said. "Then we'll talk about repayment." The ride to their shelter took only minutes on horseback, though it had been a grueling climb on foot. Joan led Raymond to the cave where she had made their home, a shallow overhang protected from the worst of the wind and snow. Timothy lay on a bed of pine boughs, covered with every scrap of fabric Joan had been able to find. His face was flushed with fever, his breathing shallow and rapid. Raymond knelt beside the boy and placed a gentle hand on his forehead. "How long has he been like this?" he asked. "4 days," Joan said, kneeling on Timothy's other side. "It started as a cough, but then the fever came and he stopped eating." Raymond nodded grimly. "Lung fever. It's common up here in winter." He opened his pack and withdrew a small bottle of clear liquid. "This will help with the fevers, but he needs proper care. Warm food, clean water, a real bed." Joan watched as Raymond carefully measured drops of medicine onto Timothy's tongue. The boy stirred slightly, but did not wake. "Will he live?" she asked, the question she had been afraid to voice. "If we get him to town soon enough," Raymond said. "But not if you try to make that journey alone. The trail is too dangerous, and he's too weak to travel fast." The implication was clear, though Joan was reluctant to accept it. "You're saying I need your help." "I'm saying your son needs it," Raymond corrected, "and I'm offering to give it." Joan studied his face in the dim light filtering through the cave entrance. He was perhaps 40 years old, with the weathered skin and steady hands of a man who had spent his life in the wilderness. There was kindness in his eyes, but also a deep sadness that spoke of losses she could only imagine. "What would you ask in return?" she said finally. "Company," Raymond said simply. "It gets lonely up here in the mountains." The answer was so unexpected that Joan almost laughed. "Company? That's all?" "That's all," Raymond confirmed. "I'm not asking you to marry me, Mrs. Taylor. I'm asking you to consider staying, at least until spring. You and the boy would be safe, fed, warm, and I would have someone to talk to besides the wind." Joan looked at Timothy's fevered face, then at the meager supplies scattered around their makeshift shelter. Everything she owned could fit in a single pack, and most of it was worn beyond usefulness. The prospect of a warm cabin, regular meals, and safety for her son was almost too good to believe. "And if I want to leave in the spring?" she asked. "Then you leave," Raymond said. "With the horse, supplies, whatever you need, no questions asked." It sounded too good to be true, which meant it probably was, but Timothy stirred restlessly, his small body shaking with chills despite his fever, and Joan felt her resistance crumble. "All right," she said, "but I want to be clear about something. I'm not looking for a husband. I'm not looking for romance. I just want to keep my son alive." "Understood," Raymond said. "I'm offering shelter and food, nothing more. What you choose to do beyond that is entirely up to you." The journey back to Raymond's cabin was slow and careful, with Timothy wrapped in blankets and held securely in Joan's arms while Raymond led the horse. The boy drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally mumbling fevered words that made no sense. Each time he grew still, Joan's heart clenched with fear, but Raymond's steady presence beside them was oddly comforting. The cabin was larger than it had appeared from her hiding place among the trees, built of solid logs with a stone foundation that spoke of permanence and care. Inside, it was warm and clean, with a large fireplace that dominated one wall and shelves lined with books, tools, and supplies. Raymond immediately set about preparing a bed for Timothy near the fire, layering soft furs and wool blankets to create a nest of warmth. "He'll be more comfortable here," Raymond said, gently lifting the boy from Joan's arms and settling him on the improvised bed. Timothy's eyes fluttered open for a moment, unfocused and glassy with fever, before closing again. Joan knelt beside her son, smoothing his damp hair back from his forehead. The contrast between this warm, safe space and the cold cave where they had been slowly dying was almost overwhelming. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Raymond replied, moving to the kitchen area where he began preparing what looked like soup. "Wait until he's well." Over the next 3 days, Joan watched her son slowly recover under Raymond's careful ministrations. The mountain man proved to be surprisingly knowledgeable about medicine, dosing Timothy with herbs and tonics that gradually broke his fever and eased his breathing. He prepared broths and teas with the patience of a natural healer, never showing frustration when the boy refused food or medicine. Joan found herself studying Raymond when she thought he wasn't looking, trying to understand this man who had shown such unexpected kindness to strangers. He was clearly educated, his shelves filled with books on subjects ranging from medicine to philosophy to poetry. His hands were skilled, not just at wilderness survival, but at delicate tasks like carving wooden toys for Timothy or mending the boy's torn clothes with neat, precise stitches. "You weren't always a mountain man," Joan said one evening as they sat by the fire, Timothy sleeping peacefully between them. Raymond looked up from the book he was reading. "What makes you say that?" "The books, the way you talk, the way you handled Timothy's fever." Joan gestured around the cabin. "This isn't the home of someone who grew up into the wilderness." "No," Raymond admitted. "I was a doctor once, in Philadelphia. I had a practice, a house in town, all the trappings of civilized life." "What happened?" Raymond was quiet for so long that Joan began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and distant. "I lost my family to an epidemic. Cholera. I couldn't save them, couldn't save any of the patients who came to me for help. After that, I found I couldn't bear to be around sick people anymore. Every cough, every fever reminded me of my failures." Joan felt a stab of sympathy for this man who had given up his calling because of grief. "So you came here." "I came here to die, if I'm being honest," Raymond said. "I thought the mountains would claim me and I wouldn't have to live with the memories anymore. But somehow I kept surviving, kept learning to live with the solitude, and eventually I found a kind of peace." "Until now," Joan said. Raymond smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Until now, funny how helping someone else can remind you why life is worth living." Joan felt heat rise in her cheeks and looked away from his steady gaze. There was something in his eyes that made her feel exposed, as if he could see through all her defenses to the frightened, lonely woman beneath. She had been alone for so long, focused entirely on Timothy's needs, that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen as a person rather than just a mother. "Tell me about your husband," Raymond said gently. Joan's hands tightened in her lap. "There's not much to tell. He died in a mining accident last spring. We'd only been married 3 years." "Were you happy?" The question surprised her with its directness. "I thought I was," Joan said slowly. "He was a good man, a hard worker. He loved Timothy, treated him like his own son. But looking back, I think I married him more for security than love. And now you are alone." "Yes." The word came out as barely more than a whisper. "And I'm still afraid." Raymond reached out and covered her hand with his, the touch gentle and warm. "You don't have to be afraid here," he said. "Not anymore." Joan looked down at their joined hands, his skin dark and weathered from years of outdoor work, hers pale and thin from hunger and worry. She should pull away, maintain the careful distance she had established between them. Instead, she found herself drawing comfort from the simple human contact, the first gentle touch she had received in months. "I should check on Timothy," she said, but made no move to withdraw her hand. "He's sleeping peacefully," Raymond said. "The fever broke this morning. He's going to be fine." Relief flooded through Joan so powerfully that she felt tears spring to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for saving him." "I told you not to thank me yet," Raymond said, but his voice was warm with satisfaction. "Though I think it's safe to say the worst is over." Joan finally pulled her hand free and wiped at her eyes, embarrassed by her tears. "I'm sorry, I don't usually cry." "You've been carrying a heavy burden," Raymond said. "It's natural to feel emotional when that weight is lifted." "I don't know how I'm going to repay you for this," Joan said. "A horse, medicine, food, shelter. You've given us everything." "I told you what I want in return," Raymond said. "Company, conversation. Someone to share meals with and talk to in the evenings. It's been a long time since this cabin felt like a home instead of just a place to survive." Joan studied his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden expectations. But she saw only honest longing, the deep loneliness of a man who had isolated himself from human connection for too long. "And that's really all you want? Nothing else?" "Nothing else," Raymond confirmed. "Though I hope in time you might come to see this as more than just a temporary arrangement." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Joan felt her pulse quicken, but whether from fear or anticipation, she couldn't say. "I told you I'm not looking for a husband," she said. And I told you I understand that, Raymond replied. I'm not asking you to marry me, Joan. I'm asking you to give this a chance. Give us a chance to see what might grow between us. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Timothy recovered his strength quickly in the warmth and safety of the cabin, his laughter returning as he played with the wooden toys Raymond carved for him. Joan found herself taking on the domestic tasks that made the cabin feel like a true home, cooking meals, mending clothes, organizing supplies. It was work she was familiar with, work that gave her a sense of purpose and contribution. Raymond was unfailingly courteous and respectful, never pushing for more intimacy than she was ready to give. He slept in a small alcove off the main room while Joan and Timothy shared the cabin's single bedroom. He included her in decisions about supplies and daily routines, treating her as a partner rather than a guest or dependent. Slowly, Joan began to relax her guard, to believe that his kindness was genuine rather than calculated. You're a good teacher, Joan said one afternoon, watching as Raymond showed Timothy how to whittle a whistle from a piece of pine. The boy was absorbed in the lesson, his small hands carefully following Raymond's patient instructions. I had a good student once, Raymond said, glancing at her with a smile. My son was about Timothy's age when I started teaching him woodworking. What was his name? Joan asked softly. Michael, Raymond said, his hands never pausing in their work. He would have been 15 this year. Joan felt a pang of sympathy for the boy Raymond had lost, the son who would never grow up to learn all the skills his father could have taught him. I'm sure he would have been proud to have you as a father, she said. I hope so, Raymond replied. I try to think he would approve of this, of me helping you and Timothy. Timothy looked up from his whittling, his young face serious. Are you going to be my new papa? He asked Raymond with the directness of childhood. Joan felt heat flood her cheeks. Timothy, that's not appropriate, she said quickly. But Raymond just smiled and ruffled the boy's hair. I'd be honored to be your friend, and he said. And maybe someday something more, but that's up to your mama to decide. Timothy seemed satisfied with this answer and returned to his carving. But Joan found herself thinking about the question long after her son had gone to bed that night. She sat by the fire, mending one of Timothy's shirts, while Raymond read quietly in his chair across from her. The domestic scene felt comfortable, natural, like something she could imagine continuing indefinitely. He's getting attached to you, Joan said finally, breaking the companionable silence. Raymond looked up from his book. Is that a problem? Joan considered the question carefully. I don't know. He's never had a stable father figure. His real father died when he was barely walking, and my second husband, while kind, was often away working the mines. Timothy's never had someone who was consistently present, consistently patient with him. And you're worried about what happens if you decide to leave in the spring, Raymond said, understanding immediately. Yes, Joan admitted. I don't want him to be hurt again. Raymond set down his book and leaned forward in his chair. Joan, I want you to know that whatever happens between us, I would never abandon Timothy. If you choose to leave, I'll make sure he understands it's not his fault, that he's a wonderful boy who deserves all the love in the world. The sincerity in his voice brought tears to Joan's eyes. You really mean that, don't you? I do, Raymond said simply. I've grown fond of him, of both of you, but I won't use a child's affection to manipulate his mother. Joan set down her mending and looked across the firelit space at this man who had shown them such unexpected kindness. Why me, she asked. You could have your pick of women in town. Why choose a widow with a child and nothing to offer? Raymond was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. Because you remind me that there's still good in the world, he said finally. Because watching you fight for your son's life reminded me why life is worth fighting for. And because when I look at you, I don't see someone with nothing to offer. I see someone with everything I've been missing. The words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable in a way that made Joan's heart race. She had been so focused on survival for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to be desired, to be seen as a woman rather than just a desperate mother. Raymond, she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. You don't have to say anything, he said. I just wanted you to know how I feel. What you do with that information is entirely up to you. Joan looked at his weathered face, at the kindness and patience that had saved her son's life and given them both a chance at something better. She thought about the long winter months ahead, the safety and warmth of this cabin, the way Timothy laughed when Raymond told him stories or taught him new skills. She thought about her own growing feelings for this gentle man who asked for nothing more than her company. "I'm scared," she admitted finally. "Of me?" Raymond asked, concern creeping into his voice. "Of this," Joan said, gesturing between them, "of caring about someone again, of building something that might not last." Raymond nodded slowly. "I understand. I'm scared too. It's been a long time since I opened my heart to anyone. What if I'm not ready? What if I can't be what you need?" "Then we'll figure it out together," Raymond said. "There's no rush, Joan. We have all winter to see what develops between us. And if nothing does, that's all right too. You and Timothy will always have a place here, regardless of what happens between you and me." Joan felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. Here was a man offering her not just safety and security, but patience and understanding. He wasn't demanding immediate love or commitment, wasn't trying to rush her into something she wasn't ready for. He was simply offering to walk beside her, to see where the path might lead. "All right," she said softly. "Let's see what develops." The first real test of their fragile arrangement came 3 weeks later, when a blizzard swept down from the high peaks and trapped them inside the cabin for nearly a week. Joan had experienced mountain storms before, but nothing like this. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the windows and doors with such force that she feared the cabin might not withstand it. Snow piled against the walls until the windows were nearly buried, creating an eerie twilight inside even during the day. Timothy was frightened by the storm's fury, clinging to Joan whenever the wind reached a particularly violent crescendo. But Raymond remained calm and reassuring, turning the enforced confinement into an adventure. He told stories of his travels before coming to the mountains, taught Timothy card games and riddles, and showed him how to make shadow puppets on the wall with the firelight. "Is the cabin going to fall down?" Timothy asked during one particularly fierce gust that made the whole structure groan. "No, son," Raymond said, the endearment slipping out naturally. "This cabin has weathered storms much worse than this one. See how thick these logs are? How deep the foundation goes? I built this place to last." Joan watched the easy way Raymond comforted her son, the natural authority in his voice that made Timothy's fears subside. It occurred to her that this was what a real father looked like, not just someone who provided for a child's physical needs, but someone who offered emotional security and guidance. The realization was both comforting and terrifying. On the fourth day of the storm, their food supplies began to run low. Raymond had plenty of preserved meat and dried vegetables, but fresh bread was a luxury they couldn't maintain during the siege. Joan found herself growing irritable from the close quarters and limited diet, snapping at Timothy over small things and then immediately feeling guilty for her harsh words. "I'm sorry," she said to Raymond, after a particularly tense moment when she had scolded Timothy for spilling water. "I'm not used to being cooped up like this." "None of us are," Raymond said mildly. "Cabin fever is a real thing up here. It's why some mountain men go a little crazy after too many winters alone." "Is that what happened to you?" Joan asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. But Raymond just smiled. "Probably, though having company seems to be a good cure for it." That evening, as Timothy slept between them on the pile of furs they had arranged near the fireplace for warmth, Joan found herself acutely aware of Raymond's presence beside her. The storm had forced an intimacy she wasn't prepared for, sharing the same small space, breathing the same air, listening to each other's quiet movements in the darkness. She could hear his steady breathing, could feel the warmth radiating from his body just at an arm's length away. "Are you awake?" Raymond's voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes," Joan replied softly, careful not to wake Timothy. "I've been thinking about what you said, about being scared of building something that might not last." Joan turned slightly to face him in the dim glow of the banked fire. "And? Nothing lasts forever," Raymond said. "My first marriage, my son, my medical practice, all of it ended eventually, but that doesn't mean it wasn't worth having while it lasted." Joan considered his words, thinking about her own losses, the way grief had made her afraid to risk her heart again. "But doesn't it hurt more when you lose something precious?" "Yes," Raymond said simply, But it also means you had something precious to lose. I'd rather have 5 years of happiness than 50 years of safety and loneliness. The honesty of his words cut straight to the heart of Joan's fears. She had been so focused on protecting herself and Timothy from further loss that she had forgotten what it meant to truly live. "You make it sound simple," she said. "It is simple," Raymond replied. "Not easy, but simple. You decide whether the risk is worth the reward." Joan lay in the darkness, listening to the storm rage outside and feeling the solid warmth of the man beside her. For the first time in months, she felt truly safe. Not just from physical danger, but from the crushing weight of responsibility she had been carrying alone. Timothy was healthy and happy. They had food and shelter, and there was a man beside her who asked for nothing more than the chance to care for them both. "Raymond," she whispered. "Yes?" "Thank you for everything, for saving Timothy, for giving us a home, for being patient with me." "You don't need to thank me," Raymond said. "Having you here has saved me too, in ways you probably don't realize." Joan felt a sudden urge to reach out, to bridge the small distance between them. But Timothy stirred in his sleep, and she held back. Still, something had shifted in the darkness. Some barrier had begun to crumble. She fell asleep thinking about Raymond's words, about the difference between existing and truly living. The storm finally broke on the seventh day, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Drifts reached nearly to the cabin's eaves, and the familiar landscape had become an alien wilderness of white. But the sun shone brilliantly in a crystal-clear sky, and the silence, after so many days of howling wind, was almost magical. The expedition to check the trap lines became Timothy's introduction to the serious business of wilderness survival. Raymond proved to be a patient teacher, explaining not just how the traps worked, but why they were placed in specific locations, how to read animal signs, how to move through the forest without disturbing the natural patterns that game animals depended on. Timothy absorbed every lesson with the intense focus of childhood, asking endless questions that Raymond answered with good-natured thoroughness. Joan followed behind them, ostensibly to help carry supplies, but really to observe this new dynamic between the man she was growing to care for and the son who meant everything to her. She watched Raymond show Timothy how to reset a snare that had been triggered by the storm, his large hands guiding the boy's smaller ones with infinite patience. She saw the way Timothy looked up at Raymond with growing admiration, the way he unconsciously began to copy the mountain man's careful, quiet movements through the forest. "He's a natural," Raymond said quietly to Joan as they paused to rest beside a frozen stream. Timothy was ahead of them, practicing the tracking skills Raymond had been teaching him. "He has good instincts, pays attention to details. He'll do well out here." "Sometimes I think he's growing up too fast," Joan said, watching her son examine a set of deer tracks in the snow. "He's had to be so mature, so responsible. I worry that he's missing his childhood." "Children are more resilient than we give them credit for," Raymond said. "And he seems happy. That's what matters." That evening, as they sat around the fire sharing the rabbits they had taken from the traps, Timothy regaled Joan with detailed accounts of everything he had learned. His face was animated with excitement as he described tracking techniques and trap construction, using terms Raymond had taught him with the precision of a much older child. "And Raymond says next week he'll show me how to use the rifle," Timothy concluded, his eyes shining with anticipation. Joan felt her stomach clench with anxiety. "You're too young for that," she said quickly. "Mama?" "I'm 7, Timothy protested. "Raymond was shooting when he was 6. "That was different," Joan said, looking to Raymond for support. But the mountain man's expression was carefully neutral, and she realized he was leaving this decision entirely to her. "Joan," Raymond said gently, "out here, knowing how to shoot isn't just a skill, it's a necessity. There are bears, mountain lions, wolves. If something happened to me, you and Timothy would need to be able to protect yourselves." The thought of something happening to Raymond sent a chill through Joan that had nothing to do with the winter cold. When had she begun to depend on him so completely? When had his presence become so essential to her sense of security? "I don't want him to get hurt," Joan said, voicing her deeper fear. "Neither do I," Raymond said. "That's why I want to teach him properly. Safely." A child who knows how to handle a weapon responsibly is much safer than one who's curious but ignorant. Joan looked at Timothy's eager face, then at Raymond's patient expression. She was outnumbered, but more than that, she was beginning to understand that her protective instincts might actually be putting her son in danger. This was not the civilized world where children could be sheltered from harsh realities. This was a place where survival skills were literally matters of life and death. "All right," she said finally, "but you follow Raymond's instructions exactly. No showing off, no taking chances." Timothy nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of the privilege being granted to him. "I promise, Mama, I'll be careful." Over the following weeks, Joan watched her son transform under Raymond's tutelage. Timothy learned to handle the rifle with respect and precision, to track game through the forest, to identify edible plants and dangerous ones. He grew stronger and more confident with each passing day, his thin frame filling out with regular meals and outdoor exercise. But it was the changes in Timothy's relationship with Raymond that affected Joan most deeply. The boy clearly adored the mountain man, following him around like a devoted shadow, hanging on his every word. And Raymond, despite his claims that he was simply offering friendship, treated Timothy with all the care and attention of a devoted father. Joan found herself watching their interactions with a mixture of warmth and trepidation. She was grateful for the positive male influence in Timothy's life, but she was also terrified of what would happen if things didn't work out between her and Raymond. How could she tear her son away from the first real father figure he had ever known? "You're thinking too much," Raymond said one evening as they sat by the fire. Timothy was asleep, exhausted from a day of learning to skin and prepare the game they had caught. "I can't help it," Joan admitted. "I keep worrying about the future, about what happens if—" "If what?" Raymond prompted gently. "If this doesn't work out between us, if I decide I can't stay. Timothy is so attached to you now. How could I explain to him that we have to leave?" Raymond set down the leather he had been working on and turned to face her fully. "Joan, do you want to leave?" The question caught her off guard with its directness. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I'm happy here, happier than I've been in years. But I'm also scared. This all feels too good to be true." "What would convince you it's real?" Raymond asked. "What would make you feel secure enough to stop waiting for the other shoe to drop?" Joan considered the question, trying to identify the source of her persistent anxiety. "I think I'm afraid that you'll change your mind," she said finally, "that you'll wake up one morning and realize you don't want the responsibility of a ready-made family, that you'll decide we're more trouble than we're worth." Raymond was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful in the firelight. When he spoke, his voice was steady and sure. "Joan, I want you to listen to me carefully. I have never been more certain of anything in my life than I am of wanting you and Timothy here with me. Not as guests, not as temporary companions, but as family." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning and possibility. Joan felt her heart race as she processed what he was saying. "I know you're not ready to hear this," Raymond continued, "but I love you. I love your strength, your devotion to your son, your courage in the face of impossible circumstances. I love the way you've brought life back to this cabin, the way you've given me a reason to look forward to each new day. And I love Timothy as if he were my own son." Joan stared at him, overwhelmed by the intensity of his declaration. "Raymond," she whispered. "I'm not asking you to say it back," Raymond said quickly. "I'm just asking you to believe it, to trust that my feelings are real and lasting, to stop waiting for me to disappoint you and start believing that we can build something permanent together." Joan felt tears spring to her eyes as Raymond's words sank in. No one had ever spoken to her with such honest emotion, such vulnerability. Her first husband had been a good man, but not given to grand declarations, and her second had been kind, but practical, their relationship based more on mutual need than deep feeling. But Raymond was offering her something she had never dared to dream of, a love that encompassed not just her, but her son as well. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to let myself believe in something so good." "One day at a time," Raymond said gently. "You don't have to decide everything tonight. Just decide to stay tomorrow. And then the day after that. Eventually, staying will feel as natural as breathing. Joan looked around the warm cabin that had become more of a home than anywhere she had lived since childhood. She thought about Timothy's laughter as he learned new skills, about the contentment she felt cooking meals and keeping house for people who appreciated her efforts. She thought about the way Raymond looked at her, not with pity or calculation, but with genuine affection and respect. "I want to try," she said finally. "I want to believe this can work." Raymond's face broke into a smile that transformed his weathered features. "That's all I ask," he said. "Just a chance to prove that some things are worth the risk." Joan felt something shift inside her chest, some long-held tension finally beginning to release. For the first time since her husband's death, she allowed herself to imagine a future that held more than just survival. She pictured Timothy growing up strong and confident under Raymond's guidance, herself finding peace and purpose in this mountain sanctuary, all of them building something lasting together. "There's something I need to tell you," Joan said, the words coming in a rush before she could lose her nerve. "About Timothy's father, my first husband." Raymond waited patiently, sensing the importance of whatever she was about to reveal. "He wasn't Timothy's biological father," Joan said, the confession she had never shared with anyone tumbling out. "Timothy's real father was a man I knew before I was married, someone I thought I loved, but who abandoned me when he found out I was pregnant. I was so ashamed, so desperate, that I married the first decent man who would have me." Raymond's expression didn't change, but he reached out and took her hand in his. "And Timothy doesn't know?" "No, his stepfather was the only father he ever knew, and he was good to him. When he died, I saw no reason to tell Timothy the truth, but I wanted you to know, in case it matters to you." "It doesn't," Raymond said without hesitation. "Timothy is a wonderful boy regardless of who fathered him, and you did what you had to do to protect him. There's no shame in that." Joan felt a weight she had carried for years finally lift from her shoulders. "You really don't care?" "The only thing I care about is the family we're building together," Raymond said. "The past is the past. What matters is what we do from here." Joan squeezed his hand, feeling truly seen and accepted for the first time in her adult life. "I think I'm falling in love with you," she whispered, the admission both terrifying and liberating. Raymond's smile was gentle and warm. "I think I fell in love with you the moment I saw you trying to steal my horse to save your son," he said. "I just had to wait for you to catch up." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands linked, watching the fire burn low in the grate. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, but inside the cabin, all was warmth and peace. Joan felt as if she were emerging from a long, dark tunnel into sunlight, finally able to see clearly after months of stumbling through uncertainty and fear. "What happens now?" she asked eventually. "Now we take it one day at a time," Raymond said. "We keep building what we've started. We teach Timothy everything he needs to know to thrive in this country. We learn to be a family together. And in the spring?" Raymond was quiet for a moment, considering. "In the spring, if you want, we could make it official, get married properly, give Timothy a legal father. But only if that's what you want. I'm happy to wait as long as you need." Joan thought about the prospect of marriage, of binding her life permanently to this man who had shown her such kindness. The idea no longer terrified her as it once had. Instead, it felt like a natural progression, the formal recognition of what they were already building together. "I'd like that," she said softly. "I'd like to be your wife." Raymond lifted their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Then that's what we'll do," he said. "When the snows melt and the pass is open, we'll ride down to town and make it official." Joan felt a bubble of happiness rise in her chest, a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. "Timothy will be so excited. He's been asking when you're going to be his real papa." "I already am his real papa in every way that matters," Raymond said. "The ceremony will just make it legal." They were interrupted by a sleepy voice from the pile of furs near the fire. "Are you going to marry Raymond, Mama?" Timothy asked, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. Joan felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't try to deflect the question. "Yes, sweetheart, in the spring when we can get to town." Timothy's face broke into a grin that rivaled the sun for brightness. "Really? He's going to be my papa forever?" Forever, Raymond confirmed, opening his arms as Timothy scrambled over to join them. If that's all right with you. Timothy threw himself into Raymond's embrace with the wholehearted enthusiasm of childhood. It's perfect, he said, his voice muffled against Raymond's shoulder. I always wanted a papa who could teach me things and tell stories and make Mama smile. Joan felt tears of joy slide down her cheeks as she watched her son embrace the man who would become his father. All the fear and uncertainty of the past months seemed to fade away, replaced by a sense of rightness and completion she had never expected to find. The remainder of the winter passed in a blur of quiet contentment and growing intimacy. Joan found herself settling into the rhythms of mountain life with surprising ease, her body growing stronger from the physical work and regular meals. Her spirit healing from the constant stress and worry that had defined her existence for so long. She learned to read the weather signs that Raymond pointed out, to preserve meat and vegetables for the lean times, to mend and maintain the equipment that kept them alive in the harsh wilderness. Timothy thrived under Raymond's patient tutelage, growing taller and more confident with each passing week. He mastered the rifle with impressive skill for one so young, learned to track game through the forest with the stealth of a natural hunter, and absorbed wilderness lore with the eager enthusiasm of childhood. But more importantly, he blossomed under the steady affection and guidance of a man who clearly loved him as his own son. I have something for you, Raymond said one evening in early March. As the first hints of spring began to show in the lengthening days and the subtle change in the quality of light, he disappeared into his alcove and returned with a small wooden box, beautifully carved with intricate designs. Joan accepted the box with wondering fingers, tracing the delicate patterns Raymond had created. It's beautiful, she said. When did you make this? In the evenings, after you and Timothy went to bed, Raymond said, looking almost shy. Open it. Inside the box, nestled on a bed of soft cloth, was a ring. Not gold or silver, but carved from what looked like antler, polished to a warm glow and inlaid with small pieces of turquoise that caught the firelight like captured sky. It was unlike any ring Joan had ever seen, clearly handmade with infinite care and attention to detail. Raymond, she breathed, lifting the ring from its resting place. It's perfect. I know it's not what most women would expect, Raymond said, uncertainty creeping into his voice. I don't have access to jewelry stores or precious metals up here, but I wanted to give you something that represented our life together, something that came from this place that's brought us together. Joan slipped the ring onto her finger, marveling at how perfectly it fit, how right it felt against her skin. I wouldn't want anything else, she said honestly. This is more beautiful than any store-bought ring because you made it for me. Timothy looked up from his writing practice, drawn by the emotion in their voices. What's an engagement? He asked with characteristic directness. It means Raymond and I are a promise to each other, Joan explained. Was showing him the ring before. It means we're going to be married as soon as we can get to town. Timothy studied the ring with serious attention, then nodded approvingly. It's pretty, Mama, and it looks like it belongs on your hand. Joan felt her heart swell with love for both of them, this man who had carved her a ring by firelight, and this boy who accepted their love with such generous enthusiasm. It does belong here, she said, looking at Raymond, just like we belong here with you. The journey to town began on a crisp morning in late March, when the snow had finally melted enough to make the mountain passes navigable. Joan felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness as she helped Raymond pack their supplies, checking and rechecking the items they would need for the 3-day ride. Timothy was practically vibrating with anticipation. Having never been to a real town before, his imagination filled with visions of stores and people and all the wonders of civilization. The ride down from the mountains was an adventure in itself, following narrow trails that wound through pine forests and across rushing streams swollen with snowmelt. Joan had forgotten how beautiful the country was from horseback, how much more you could see from the higher vantage point. She rode behind Raymond, with Timothy on a gentle mare Raymond had acquired specifically for the boy, and marveled at the changing landscape as they descended toward the valley. They reached the settlement of Cedar Falls on the afternoon of the 3rd day, riding down the main street past wooden buildings that seemed impossibly large and elaborate after months in Raymond's simple cabin. Joan stared at the general store, The saloon, the hotel, the church with its white-painted steeple, feeling like a visitor from another world. Timothy's eyes were wide with wonder as he took in the sights and sounds of civilization. Raymond led them directly to the hotel, a two-story building with a painted sign and glass windows that reflected the afternoon sun. The proprietor, a middle-aged man with a carefully waxed mustache, greeted them with professional courtesy that warmed considerably when Raymond produced a small bag of gold dust to pay for their rooms. "Welcome to the Mountain View Hotel," the man said. "I'm Samuel Morrison, the owner. How long will you be staying with us?" "2 nights," Raymond replied. "We're here to be married." Morrison's face broke into a genuine smile. "Congratulations. Pastor Williams performs ceremonies every Sunday after regular service, if that suits your needs." "Sunday service would be perfect," Joan said. "We'd like to be married properly in front of the congregation." They were given 2 adjoining rooms on the second floor, with Timothy staying with Joan and Raymond taking the room next door. That evening they walked through the town together, Timothy marveling at every new sight while Joan and Raymond quietly observed the rhythms of settled life. The general store was indeed everything Timothy had imagined, filled with goods from the outside world that seemed exotic and wonderful after their mountain isolation. Raymond bought him candy and a small wooden top that the boy clutched like a treasure. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, with the promise of spring and the warm air and the sound of birdsong from the trees that lined the town's main street. Joan woke early, her stomach fluttering with nervous excitement as she prepared for her wedding day. She had purchased a simple but elegant dress from the general store the day before, a soft blue cotton with tiny white flowers that complemented her coloring and fit her improved figure perfectly. Timothy was equally excited, dressed in his new clothes and trying to slick down his unruly hair with water from the wash basin. "Do I look like a proper town boy?" he asked, turning in front of the mirror. "You look perfect," Joan assured him, though privately she thought he looked more like a young mountain man playing dress-up. Raymond met them in the hotel lobby, looking handsome and distinguished in a dark suit he had somehow managed to acquire. His hair was neatly trimmed and his beard shaped, but his weathered hands and sun-lined face marked him clearly as a man of the wilderness. Joan felt her heart skip as he offered her his arm. "Are you ready, Mrs. Taylor?" he asked with a gentle smile. "More than ready, Mr. Nelson," Joan replied. The church was a simple white building with tall windows that let in streams of golden sunlight. The congregation was small but welcoming, mostly families from the town and surrounding farms who had come for regular Sunday service. Pastor Williams was a kindly man in his 60s who had spoken with them at length the day before about the nature of marriage and the commitments they were undertaking. Joan felt a moment of panic as she walked down the aisle on Raymond's arm, suddenly aware of all the eyes upon them. But then she looked at Raymond's steady, reassuring presence beside her and felt her anxiety fade. This was right, she knew with absolute certainty. Whatever the future held, she belonged with this man who had saved her son's life and shown them both what it meant to be truly loved. Timothy stood beside them as Raymond's best man, his young face serious with the importance of his role. When Pastor Williams asked if anyone objected to the union, the boy actually turned around to scan the congregation, as if prepared to defend their right to happiness against any challenger. The gesture was so earnest and protective that several people in the congregation smiled, and Joan felt tears of joy prick her eyes. "Do you, Raymond Nelson, take this woman, Joan Taylor, to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Pastor Williams intoned. "I do," Raymond said, his voice clear and strong, his eyes never leaving Joan's face. "Do you, Joan Taylor, take this man, Raymond Nelson, to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Joan felt the weight of the moment, the significance of the words she was about to speak. This was more than just a legal ceremony. It was a promise, a commitment, a declaration of faith in their shared future. "I do," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. The ring Raymond had carved for her was already on her finger, but he had also acquired a simple gold band to make their union official in the eyes of the law. As he slipped it onto her finger beside his handmade ring, Joan felt the symbolism of the 2 bands, one representing their unique love story and the other their place in the larger community of married couples. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Pastor Williams declared. You may kiss your bride. Raymond's kiss was gentle and reverent, a promise of all the kisses to come. When they broke apart, the congregation erupted in applause and congratulations, and Joan felt herself swept up in a wave of community goodwill that warmed her heart. The reception that followed was simple but heartfelt, with cake and coffee provided by the church ladies and toasts offered by several of the townspeople who had known Raymond during his occasional visits to town. Joan found herself the center of attention in a way she hadn't experienced since her first wedding years ago. But this time the attention felt warm and genuine rather than overwhelming. "Ready to go home?" Raymond asked as the reception began to wind down. Joan looked around the church hall, at the friendly faces and warm smiles, at the evidence of community and belonging that she had thought lost to her forever. It was tempting to stay, to become part of this settled life with its predictable rhythms and social connections. But when she thought of their mountain cabin, of the peace and privacy of their wilderness sanctuary, she knew where her heart truly lay. "Yes," she said, shifting Timothy's sleeping weight more comfortably against her shoulder. "Let's go home." The months that followed their wedding settled into a rhythm of contentment that Joan had never dared to imagine possible. Spring brought an explosion of life to the mountains, with wildflowers carpeting the meadows and wildlife emerging from winter hibernation. Timothy thrived in this environment, growing taller and stronger with each passing week, his skills as a woodsman developing under Raymond's patient guidance. Joan found herself pregnant by midsummer, a development that filled all three of them with joy and anticipation. Raymond was tender and protective during her pregnancy, taking over the heavier chores while still encouraging her to remain active. Timothy was thrilled at the prospect of becoming a big brother, already making plans for all the things he would teach the new baby. The baby was born in late winter during a gentle snowfall that seemed to bless their growing family with peace and beauty. Raymond delivered the child himself, his medical training proving invaluable in the isolated cabin. Mary Elizabeth Nelson arrived healthy and strong, with her father's dark hair and her mother's determined chin. Timothy was instantly smitten with his baby sister, appointed himself her official protector, and took his new responsibilities with touching seriousness. "She's perfect," Joan said, watching Raymond rock the baby by the firelight, while Timothy practiced his letters at the table nearby. "Our family is perfect." "It is," Raymond agreed, his voice filled with wonder. "Sometimes I can't believe this is real, that I have all of you." Joan understood the feeling. There were moments when she looked around their warm cabin at her healthy children and devoted husband and felt overwhelmed by the abundance of her blessings. The woman who had once been so desperate that she would steal a horse to save her son now had everything she had ever dreamed of, and more. As Mary grew from infant to toddler, the cabin filled with the sounds of childhood joy. Timothy taught her to walk by coaxing her with wooden toys Raymond had carved, and her first word was Timmy, much to her big brother's delight. She was a mountain child from birth, comfortable with the sounds of wildlife and weather, unafraid of the vast wilderness that surrounded their home. The years passed in a blur of seasons and growth, with Timothy developing into a skilled young woodsman and Mary proving to be as fearless and capable as her mother. The cabin that had once housed a lonely bachelor now rang with the voices of children, the sounds of family life, the everyday miracles of love and laughter. Joan often thought about the desperate woman she had once been, driven to theft by starvation and fear. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone from another life entirely. She had found not just survival, but abundance, not just shelter, but home, not just existence, but purpose and joy. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Raymond one evening as they sat on the porch, watching their children play in the yard while the sun set behind the mountains. Taking in a desperate widow and her son? Raymond looked at her with surprise and something that might have been hurt. "Regret the best decision I ever made? Never. You and the children are the greatest gifts of my life." Joan smiled and took his hand, the same hand that had once held a rifle while she stood trembling beside his horse. "I love you," she said, the words as natural now as breathing. "I love you too," Raymond replied, bringing her hand to his lips for a gentle kiss. "All of you. More than I ever thought possible." As darkness fell and they called the children inside for supper, Joan reflected on the strange turns that life could take. She had come to this mountain as a thief, desperate and alone, expecting nothing but death or imprisonment. Instead, she had found love, family, and a happiness so complete it sometimes took her breath away. The horse she had tried to steal had carried her not to safety, but to home, and the man who had caught her had kept not just the horse, but her heart as well. The fire crackled in the hearth as they gathered around the table for their evening meal, their voices blending in the comfortable chaos of family life. Joan looked around at their faces, illuminated by firelight and love, and knew that she was exactly where she belonged. She had stolen nothing in the end, but had been given everything. The mountain man who had caught her trying to take his horse had offered her something far more valuable in return, a lifetime of love, a family to call her own, and a home in the wilderness where her heart could finally rest.